Well, we're going to talk about Chapter 7 today, and the title of Chapter 7 is Deviance, Crime, and Social Control. And so before we get into the few key learning objectives that I wrote down that I want to be sure that you get from this chapter, I want to quickly do the true and false test with you, that your questionnaire that's on the opening page, because the title of it is How Much Do You Know About U.S. Deviance and Crime? I'm going to read these sentences to you. Maybe you've done this already, reading the chapter. And think about whether you think they're true or false, as I read them. And then at the end, I'll tell you what the story is here. Okay. Number 1, all deviant behavior is criminal. Number 2, deviance serves a useful purpose in society. 3, most crime victims are women. 4, crime rates have decreased since 1990. 5, people are more likely to be arrested for a drug violation than for driving while drunk. 9, murder and assault are more common than illegal gambling and prostitution. 7, suburbs are safer than cities. 8, the death penalty deters crime. Well, it might surprise you to know, unless you've really done your homework, read the chapter and absorbed it and that type of thing, is that they're all false except for 3 of them. And the 3 that are true are deviance serves a useful purpose in society, which we're going to learn about in the lecture as we talk about that. The next true one is that crime rates have decreased since the 1990s, although as you'll see as we move through this, many Americans think crime has gotten worse. It hasn't. It's decreased dramatically since the 1990s when it was at its height. And the other true one is that people are more likely to be arrested for a drug violation than for driving while drunk. So, and all those others are false. And as we go through the chapter, you'll see why they're false and why the ones that were true are true. So, some of the key learning objectives, I only identified a couple that I thought were really crucial for this chapter. One is the difference between deviance and crime. There is a difference, and that's why that first question is false. All deviant behaviors are crime. No, that's not true. We all partake in or act out deviant behaviors at various times in our life, but we're not all committing crimes. And then the second learning objective is identify and evaluate the criminal justice system's social control methods. So you know what that means, the social control methods. That's what sociologists refer to as the criminal justice system, and their social control methods, from prison arrests, that type of thing. So what is deviance? Well, sociologists have a very non-judgmental about what deviance is in terms of the definition of deviance. Deviance is simply a violation of social norms. One deviates from social norms. It can be a minor deviation, it can be a major deviation. It can be a criminal deviation if it's written into law. Okay. So sociologists want to know and to understand, explain why everyone violates norms. Everyone, as I said, to one degree or another, at some point in their life, violates some kind of a norm. Even if it's just being late to something you're supposed to absolutely be on time to. And since everyone deviates from the norm to one degree or another at some point in their life, why are some deviant acts, viewed as more negative than others? That's another question. Now, what crime is, and I've referred to this, it's a violation of a society's formal laws. Let's go back to what the definition of deviance is. A violation of social norms. You see the difference there. So the key characteristics of deviance are, it's usually something we do. we often treat others differently. And this is it. Can be you can be one could be treated as outsiders because of appearance, skin color, religious beliefs, or sexual orientation, something out of our norm. Okay. It's accompanied, another point about deviance. It can be a trait, a belief, or a behavior. That idea that people who don't look like you are, deviant in some way, race, color, gender, ethnicity, whatever, ability, um, comes from a belief, doesn't it? Okay. The second point is about deviance, what it is, characteristics. It's accompanied by social stigmas. So there's a negative label that attaches to someone who is perceived as not normal, in whatever category that may be. And it's always a negative one, so it devalues the person who's supposedly deviant. And it changes their not only their self concept, but their social identity as well. So people who are stigmatized react in very different ways. Sometimes they alter their appearance with cosmetic surgery, if that's something. Sometimes they try to be normal by changing their appearance. Others give up on being normal and they wind up hanging out with others like themselves who will accept them. And gang membership, as we talked about that in the last chapter, is an example of that. To the rest of us, they're deviants, but they have a group together. And then another way of dealing with those labels, those stigmatizing labels, is to hide information about ourselves. So they talk about an ex-con, for example. I just heard a National Public Radio story about somebody who was a performer that I was not familiar with, so I can't remember the name, but who had just come out and said that he was HIV positive, and he's been hiding it since 2001. There was such a stigma associated with that. Gender and sexual orientation can be a huge social stigma. People who are considered deviant, we're getting better about that, but historically, and so that's often been hidden. Okay. Now, deviance, of course, varies from society to society and culture to culture, and also within societies in different groups. So, what's considered deviant behavior can vary between cultures and societies and within cultures and societies. What's going on in one society may be deviant in another. Okay. So you can think about polygamy. There are more individual polygamous societies. Some of them are tiny, some of them are huge, like most Muslim countries. Then there are monogamous societies, but they're deviant in each other's cultures, right? And you get that happening in your culture. That's either like in a monogamous society, polygamy is not generally tolerated, even though it's a standard in the particular society of the people that came here. So other examples, I love this one they give you, and it's appropriate for this book. I mean, this chapter. So the U.S. is only 5% of the world's population, but we account for the U.S. accounts for 31% of mass shootings. And the definition of a mass shooting, lest you think people are mixing apples and oranges here or something and not counting properly, the definition that the text and the research is using for this, that we're 5% of the world's population, we're responsible for 31% of the world's mass shootings. The definition of that is 4 more people killed outside of their homes and aren't gang related, or hostage situations or robberies. So all that's eliminated. We're not counting that in. Between 1983 and 2013, we had 78 mass shootings. That's twice as many as 24 other countries combined. Industrialized nations combined. We're not looking at the poor nations now. That's twice as many as 24 other industrialized nations combined. And in the US, 8 of the 10 deadliest mass shootings between 1982 and 2016 occurred in the South and the West. So we know across countries and within countries that from state to state, when we're talking about within countries in our particular situation, stricter gun laws, lower firearm ownership rates are correlated with fewer mass shooting incidents. Now, deviance varies across situations as well as across and within societies. The across and within societies, one of the things they're talking about there are the states that don't have good, or strong, strict gun laws, et cetera, et cetera. They're a higher rate of gun violence. So in varying across situations, what's acceptable in one context may not be acceptable in another. Where you use cell phones, how, who wants to listen to your conversation in a particular situation, right? On a cell phone. Those types of things. Some behaviors are considered deviant in some places. U.S. adults between 77% say it's generally okay to use cell phones on public transportation while walking down the street, waiting in line, but only 4 to 5% say it's okay in movie theaters and meetings and religious services. So the appropriateness has a lot to do with deviance. What's appropriate behavior? What would be considered normal? Deviance is both formal and informal. Formal deviance is crime, for example, behavior that violates the law. That's the main example. But informal deviance is behavior that's not accepted as a normal social norm, an acceptable social norm. So, belching in public or dressing inappropriately. I mean, there's just such a huge, many, many, many examples of that. It also differs by generation, of course, as well, what's appropriate and inappropriate. And that's where we move into the next part, which is this perceptions of what deviance is change over time. So it wasn't until, for example, and this may be shocking to those of you who don't know this, but it wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that there were crime, that it was considered a crime, a formal legal crime, date rape and marital rape, as well as stalking and child abuse. Okay. Hasn't been that long ago, has it? So those were not formal forms of deviance previously that you could get arrested for or get into serious trouble for. What about smoking in the public in public in the past? There was no law against that. It was extremely common. You'd go into meetings and the room would be just filled with smoke. Office, buildings and places where people work were filled with smoke. That's not appropriate anymore. Okay. In 2017 in Nevada, there were vending machines with free needles for addicts. Well, you wouldn't have found that many years earlier. That was a new thing that was being unstigmatized. Okay. There are some others. What about some other things that were stigmatized in the past and are okay now, like cohabitation? If you were living with somebody else, you sure didn't want your parents to know that, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And not that many people were, by the way. We've seen a huge change in the whole idea about the legalization of pot. That's completely different. Something that was highly stigmatized. You could get a very long jail sentences for possession of marijuana. And I know in some states you still can, but you can see what I'm saying, that the stigmatization of it is pretty much very changed and gone. And then tattoos. It might be interesting to some of you. When I was a child growing up, that was tattoos were really not okay. They were not normal. They were they deviated from normal presentation of self and appearance. That has completely changed, hasn't it? So that is the point of this, that they change over time. There are new ones and old ones go away often. Who decides what's deviant? Well, it's mostly people in authority and power. as you might imagine. In the early years, it's our parents and our teachers and, you know, people who teach us and specify what's socially accepted behavior, which is what isn't even. When we're older, it's also not only the people around us we respect to keep us in line to a certain extent, but it's also the laws that define formal deviance. Employers enforce rules about what they consider okay and not okay. Body art's another example of that. There are employers who will not hire people with body art. And it depends on the location as well and what's considered normal in, Portland is not necessarily what's considered normal in Eastern, in far Baker, Oregon, or somewhere extremely rural and isolated. So that's employers. Many laws are passed that must be obeyed, but people often exempt themselves and say, well, it doesn't really apply to me. And you know how that works, I'm sure. Public attitudes and behaviors affect definitions of deviance as well. Think about if you change the language, we've worked on this with language a lot, that stigmatizes people, which is what you do to people who aren't normal, who are deviants, right? So now those attitudes towards what used to be deviance have changed from, for there's some examples your text gives, overweight instead of fat or obese. It decreases stigmatization using those words. But the flip side of that positive trend to stop stigmatizing people then becomes what's called the normalization of deviance. So there's this gradual process by which unacceptable practices or standards become acceptable. I always bring this up in different points in classes, but I remember there was a period of time when it was very popular to wear pajama bottoms and slippers to class. I'm sure that was happening in colleges and universities all over the country. But you can imagine how I reacted to that. I didn't say anything to people. I didn't stigmatize anybody or point them out. But it really shocked me and surprised me because it seemed so inappropriate and not normal to me behavior. So some other examples of things that have become normalized that were once the normalization of deviance that were highly deviant and stigmatized are same-sex marriage, interracial marriage, legalized gambling, recreational marijuana, again, that type of thing. So now we're going to look at types of deviance and then get into crime. So non-criminal deviance. Some examples, and there's tens of thousands of examples. These are just the ones your text uses. Suicide, alcoholism, lying, mental illness, adult pornography. Those are all common forms of deviance. And sociologists are, what they're mainly interested in is not non-criminal deviance as much as criminal deviance, the kinds of behaviors that violate laws. And that's what this chapter is about, right? Crime in the criminal justice system. So in that case, if you're going to study crime, you have to be able to measure crime to a certain extent and find out what's really going on with crime. So there's a discussion here about how crime statistics are formulated. There's two major ones: the FBI Uniform Crime Report, the UCR, and the Department of Justice's National Crime Victimization Survey, NCVS. They both have their strengths and weaknesses. With the Uniform Crime Report, listen to the term crime report. Those are crimes that are reported to police and arrests that are made each year. So to look at trends over a period of time, over years, it's useful. But the reason it's not terribly useful is because so many crimes are unreported, and so many criminals are not arrested. So the UCR, the Uniform Crime, excuse me, it's useful examining over time. It doesn't include not only the things that I just mentioned, that it's only reported crimes, it's only arrests. It also doesn't include corporate crime, kidnapping, internet crimes, simple assaults, those that don't involve weapons or serious injury, nor the 53% of all violent crimes, which include rape, robbery, aggravated assault, and 65% of property crimes, burglary, motor vehicle theft, that are not reported to the police. So 53% of all violent crimes, 65% of all property crimes are never reported to the police. So because of the above those limitations, the sociologists also use victimization surveys. And those are interviews where they go out and interview people who have been crime victims. Now, we know that many victims don't report their crimes either to the police or to the interviewers for many reasons, reprisal, getting the offender into trouble, that type of thing. Some people don't want to admit being victims, especially when a family member is the perpetrator, or if they've been victimized while they're drunk or doing drugs or something. So what we come down to is we do the best that we can at figuring out what's going on with crime with the statistics that we have, because no one knows the full extent of U.S. crime. Because only the very best sources provide only estimates and data, and also the data for higher income and powerful people who are offenders isn't generally available, which we're going to look at here in a minute. We know a lot about street crime, but we don't know a lot about CEO crime, right? In terms of who they are, and because they get into the court system that often. So what are the definition of street crimes? The majority of Americans say that crime is an extremely or very serious problem. When they say that, what they're usually referring to are violent crimes, either against a person or property crimes. So let's look at the incidence of violent and property crimes. Property crimes are more common than violent crimes. The rates of both have been dropping since the 1990s. So between 2008 and 2015, violent and property crimes fell by 26% and 22% respectively, about a quarter each, dropped by about a quarter. The average person is about 433 times more likely to experience a theft than to be murdered. And the odds of either are much less now than they were in the early 1990s, when, once again, that was when our crime rate was the very highest. So why is there such a disconnect between the perception of crime and the crime rate and the official statistics? Well, the media has a lot to do with it, and they're not talking about the news so much here, although that's part of it. But it's a journalist's responsibility to report when there are major crimes or mass shootings or a variety of things. What they're talking about here is television shows and movies that exaggerate the prevalence of crime. So now let's look at some stats about offenders and victims. Okay, this may surprise you, maybe not if you've read it. So most offenders, I don't know if you know this, are never caught. And of those arrested, but for what we know, of those arrested, 34% are under the age of 25, 30% are the ages 25 to 34, and only 5% are 55 or older. And most of those crimes for the older people were drunk driving and drug abuse, that type of thing. 73% of those arrested are males, counted for 80% of arrests for violent crime and 62% for property crime. 70% of those arrested are white, 27% black, 3% American Indian, Latino, or Asian. Men are more likely than women to be the victims of crime as well as the perpetrators of crime. But the type of victimization of men and women, criminal victimization, differs greatly. So for males, homicide, robbery, and aggravated assault are the primary crimes against males. For females, as you unfortunately might guess, it's rape, sexual assault, and intimate partner violence. And the violent victimization rates are lower for whites and Latinos than they are for Blacks, Asians, and American Indians. That's the violent victimization rates. The violent victimization rates are also much higher for people under 25 than those 65 and older. I kind of want to go, duh, that's not a big surprise. But they're also much more prevalent among lower income households. Those under 10,000 a year are almost 4 times more likely than higher income households, $75,000 a year or more, to experience violent victimization. So the poorer you are, the more likely you are to experience violence and be a victim of violence. A lot of that has to do with where people live, the kind of jobs they do, the hours they work when they're out in the world, coming and going, that type of thing. So although overall, the most likely to be victimized in violence are the young, African Americans, females, poor, those who live in urban areas, and men and women who are divorced and separated. Oh, I'm sorry, and women. I was going to say that doesn't make sense. Women who are divorced and separated. They're often victims of violence by their ex-partners. So although the crime rates are higher in low-income areas, does that correlate with, or is there causation that poor people are more violent? And as you might guess, the answer is no. There's much more police presence in those areas. And so poor people are much more likely to be caught, to be arrested, to be prosecuted. If you've got a public defender, which most poor people do, they will invariably recommend that you plead guilty, whether you're guilty or not. And so they're much more likely to be caught, arrested, prosecuted, and incarcerated. The other kinds of crimes, just as an example, people don't necessarily get caught for, and don't go to, are things like intellectual property theft, which is a middle class crime. And those people, for the most part, don't get caught. They don't get incarcerated. Now, let's look at hate crimes. We just looked at violent crimes and victimization. Let's look at hate crimes. The reasons for hate crimes are shown in a pie chart on the page where the section on hate crimes is. Hate crimes are also known as bias crime. People are biased against the person that they're perpetrating the crime on. And the definition of a hate crime is a criminal offense motivated by the fact or perception that the victims differ from their perpetrator. Here we get into these people are deviant, they're different, right? So the example they give you, a very sad example. Some of you may remember that in 2016, Dylan Roof, who killed 9 African Americans in a church in Carolina because, as he said, quote, the blacks are taking over the world. So hate crimes are attacks based on prejudice toward race, ethnicity, ancestry, religion, disability, sexual orientation, gender, or gender identity. The FBI stats say there were almost 7,000 hate crimes in 2015, 83% towards individuals and about 17% towards businesses and churches and things of that nature. But of course, the number is much higher than that because more than half of the victims don't report hate crimes to the police. 60% of hate crimes are racially motivated. 48% of the offenders who perpetrate hate crimes are white, 24% are black, 16% unknown race, and 9% multiracial. So the vast majority, half of the racially motivated hate crimes are white. Why do people commit hate crimes? Well, I mean, it really isn't rocket science. There are several reasons that people commit hate crimes. There are thrill hate crimes. People say they're just, quote, having fun by attacking minorities, bashing gays, or destroying property. Doesn't sound like fun, but that's the rationale. Um, the perpetrators of what are called definite hate crimes, when isn't somebody saying that they're, quote, just having fun, but that they're definite hate crimes, feel justified. They even feel obligated. We've seen so much of this lately in the news. They feel justified and obligated to, for example, protect their neighborhood against outsiders of the, quote, wrong race or ethnicity or their country, right, or their state, whatever. And then that's definite hate crimes. Then there are what are called retaliatory hate crimes. And those are motivated by revenge for a real or imagined incident of some kind. So the example your text gives is attacking Muslims after the Boston Marathon bombing. Uh, a more recent one is attacking Asians because of the rumor that China knowingly caused the COVID epidemic. All right, that was hate crimes. Now we're looking at different kinds of crimes. So we looked at violent crimes, we looked at hate crimes. Now we're looking at white collar crimes. This is where the money is, right? Is with white collar crimes. This is where huge amounts of money is lost. So it's illegal activities committed by high status people in the course of their occupations. They're not violent crimes because you don't need violence to do white collar crime. You use your high status to enrich yourselves and others. So the typical white collar crimes include embezzlement, theft, bribery, insider trading, mortgage investment fraud, that type of thing. Bernie Madoff is a perfect example of that. He defrauded investors in his company of $18 billion. There's a picture of him in your text there. And he got 150 years in prison. He's one of the few who were actually arrested, went through the justice system, and has some major punishment. Bank tellers are especially susceptible. They've got all your info, right? And I don't know if you remember the Wells Fargo thing that happened, but between 2011 and 2015, Wells Fargo employees opened over 2 million fake bank accounts in order to meet their sales goals that came down from their superiors. So what happened was Wells Fargo clients of the bank paid $2.6 million in unnecessary fees. So white collar crime is very lucrative because most offenders aren't caught. And only about there's only about one FBI investigator for 4,000 financial services employees. Now of course they're not caught. So even when they are caught and they're arrested and they're convicted, very few of them go to jail. Out of 3,800 suspected embezzlers, only 14% were arrested and sentenced. And at that point, only 7% of those served any prison time. So moving from white collar crime, which is more individuals in businesses, corporate crimes are huge. And the definition of corporate crimes are illegal acts committed by executives to benefit themselves and their companies. So things like conspiracies to control free market competition, price fixing, tax evasion, false advertising, all of those things are examples. And the target of those things can be those conspiracies to do that, can be the general public, it can be the environment. Oh, the oil companies, we don't even need to get into that right now. Or the company's own workers can be being ripped off or put into danger, right, when they know something. So it's often multiple crimes that are being committed at the same time. Corporate crime is extremely common. The automobile industry is rife with it. So here's some examples from your text. I'm just taking the time to go through them because they're great examples and it will give you some concrete examples, okay? General Motors knew about the malfunctioning ignition switch in their vehicles in 2001, but they didn't recall the vehicles until 2014 after dozens of death and injury lawsuits. I'm going to explain why they don't change this in a minute, okay? At least, here's another example, at least 4 automakers knew of defective airbags linked to death, injuries, but they installed them anyway, quote, to save on costs. And that's the key point. It's called a cost benefit analysis. How much do we have to pay off the families of dead people or to pay off injured people, as opposed to how much do we have to pay to retool all of our factories to reinstall something or throw away all those airbags and buy all new ones? It usually costs more to fix the problem than to pay off people who've been killed or injured. Cost benefit analysis, okay? And here's the last example. Volkswagen cheated on pollution tests, and executives knew that their diesel cars were giving off more than 40 times the legal limit of nitrogen oxide. And they had tinkered with the, whatever it is, catalytic converter or whatever that is, they test emissions. And they did that purposely. So corporate crime is common because it's profitable. And as I said, they do the cost benefit analysis. And so, let's see. The cybercrime is the next thing. You're very familiar with cybercrime, I'm sure. All the, things that happen online, defrauding consumers, fake financial investments, embezzling, phishing expeditions, all of that. Organized crime, I'm sure you're familiar with that as well. That involves things like human and drug trafficking, loan sharking, illegal gambling, pornography, that type of thing. And one of the most profitable of organized crime is retail crime, interestingly, which is stealing billions of dollars of merchandise and then selling them online, fencing them, in other words. What about victimless crimes? Have you ever thought about the victimless crimes? So those are illegal acts that have no direct victim. They're voluntary acts. But of course, as we talk through this, they do have victims. So illicit drug use, prostitution, illegal gambling, pornography, those are considered victimless crimes. And because often the people involved doing those things, using drugs, gambling illegally, partaking in pornography, they don't consider themselves victims and they don't report the offenses. Prostitutes, historically, some of them, the rationale is, well, we're just providing services that people want, and drug users only hurting themselves. Well, actually, what happens is that victimless crimes often lead to property and violent crimes. So yeah, you're a drug user, you're only hurting yourself, but you get desperate for your drugs, and so you steal money or a property in order to be able to buy your drugs. That's not victimless. And prostitutes are often, of course, unfortunately, horribly abused and drugged and may be made addicted to drugs to get into, to be prostitutes and stay prostitutes. Not all, but many, more than not, okay? And then what about the effects on the family? If any of you have had a situation, for instance, with someone who's addicted to drugs or an alcoholic in your family, you know that it's not a victimless crime, is it? It affects so many people. Well, now what we're going to do, we look through the types of crime. We're going to talk about the different sociological perspectives on crime. And the first one is the functionalist perspective on deviance. There's a table that you can look up that lists the functions and dysfunctions according to functionalists. So first, let's look at the dysfunctions of crime, because that's pretty much what we think about when we think of, deviance, not just crime. When we think of deviance, we basically think of it as being primarily dysfunctional, and it is very dysfunctional in these ways. So it creates tension and insecurity in a society. Any violation of norms makes life unpredictable, and it increases anxiety. Remember elevator behavior from the last chapter, things can make us very nervous if they're unpredictable as human beings. It erodes trust, deviance does. It erodes trust in personal and formal relationships. So think about crimes like date rape and stalking that makes many women very suspicious of men and very fearful. And victims of identity theft have trouble getting banking services. So it erodes all those relationships that we kind of count on to be there. Another thing that deviance does in society that's dysfunctional is it decreases confidence in institutions. So if you, the example they're giving there is the 2008 stock market crash. Um, we taxpayers had to pay that huge bailout. This was corporate crime, white collar crime, for people who, basically ripped off the market in a variety of ways. People's retirements funds were gone. And it worried everybody. So you lose confidence in the institutions of society when they behave in a deviant manner. Also, deviance is extremely costly. And it's not just the personal costs. It's we all pay higher prices for consumer goods, for instance, due to shoplifting. That's just an example. I just read an article where shoplifting, it's not like you're returning like it used to be, where the clothes were returned to the store and then, put back into stock and sold again. Now that's not happening as much. And they're just eating, the stores, the retail businesses are just eating, the value of those things. So it's costing a huge amount of money. Then we all pay higher prices for whatever we're purchasing because of that, in the way of, for instance, clothing or retail goods. Also, deviance is dysfunctional because prisons are expensive. We'll see as we get into that. We're going to break it down a little bit. Compared to education, oh my God, prisons are incredibly expensive. So who pays for that? Taxpayers, okay? Now, those are all the dysfunctions. What are the functions of deviance? Well, the first thing, by the very fact that there are those deviants over there that we see are doing bad or wrong or deviant things, breaking the rules, it affirms our own cultural norms and values about what's right. And when you have negative sanctions, whether that's getting expelled from school or fired from a job or put in jail, what that does is it reinforces those norms and values that we're told we're supposed to obey and abide by. Another function of deviance, interestingly, is it provides temporary safety valves when it's kind of a formalized form of deviance. So Mardi Gras is a perfect example. Where the heck in our culture can women run around without their top on and not only not get arrested, but be rewarded for it with a string of beads? Well, in Mardi Gras and public drunkenness and, that type of thing. Easter week with college students is another one where, everybody expects the beach to be a mess and drunkenness and, all of that after Easter week is over. But it has to be at a certain time. It has to have a beginning and an end for that to provide temporary safety valves. Also, it can bolster the economy in terms of, yes, prisons are very, very expensive, but if a small, poor town uh, gets a prison built there, then there's going to be jobs and that sort of thing happening. So that's important. And then there's also, they can trigger social change. Deviance, it's functional. And I'm going to put it on pause for once. Okay, so another positive functional aspect of deviance is that it triggers social change. So if you think about the driving laws that have changed over the years, so drunk driving, laws came into a being, and that's reduced deadly, crashes and that type of thing, and a variety of other things, and there are certainly a lot of things that laws, when they're, what about the motorcycle helmet law? Okay, there's a law that saved a lot of lives, that type of thing. So there's ways that law actually can very much have positive consequences in terms of social change and what we think of as okay to do. I think the newer laws about not texting or using your cell phone when you're driving is another example. That saved some lives. So now let's look at what's called anomie and social strain. Okay. Anomie, Emil Durkheim coined this term, is a condition in which people are unsure how to behave because everything you thought you knew about social norms and behavior is either absent, gone, conflicting, or very confusing. It happens in periods of very rapid social change. Once again, I think what's going on right now in the country and the world is an example of that. But they're going back in time to industrialization when people had to switch from being craftsmen and, working from home where there were no, until industrialization, there were no bosses, there were no factories. You didn't go somewhere to work. You didn't move from the country to the city and live in a tenement and work in a factory for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week for a pittance. You know, that was a huge social change that occurred and created anomie because it took a while for everybody to figure out that all the rules were gone of how we all lived and behaved, how they all lived and behaved. War is another example of anomie. All the rules are gone. All the norms are gone. You don't know. I mean, a little darling child could be a bomber, say, if you're in Iraq or Afghanistan. You don't know. It's the not knowing, and that so that type of thing is very disturbing to people. Today, another point that your text made that's making people nervous, and the conditions in which people are unsure how to behave because of is the growth of the non-white population is making people feel a little off balance. So what's the social strain theory? This is a very interesting theory, okay? And that's Robert Merton. So people might engage in deviant behavior, and often do, when they experience a conflict between the goals of the society and the means to obtain them. And there's a table on page 127 that shows us. So a conformist accepts the social goals and it accepts the means to achieve those social goals. And the example that your text gives you is a college graduate. A social goal is to be middle class, get a good job, have a nice profession, buy a home, all of that, blah, 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 blah. Those are cultural goals. How do you do that? Well, it's pretty hard in America without a college degree to do any of that, unless you're a great athlete or a great, musician or an actor or something, which is less than 1% of the population. So they accept, a conformist accepts the goals of society, and they accept the way you're supposed to do them. Work hard, pay attention, don't get into trouble, all of that. Examples, college graduate. An innovator accepts the goals of society. Yeah, I want all those goodies. I want all that middle and upper middle class stuff, the fancy house, the nice car, vacations, etc. But I don't accept that I have to trudge through, 6 to 8 years of college to get them, or work really hard or any of that. Why don't I just steal them, right? Why don't I just steal what I need? So an innovator, innovation is a term that sociologists often use for criminals, of ways to get what you want without doing it with the cultural norm way. Ritualism, that person doesn't accept the goals anymore, but they do accept the means of how you're supposed to get them. So their example there is a low-level bureaucrat. It's like the guy who stays in a job for 30 years, because people used to do this. He knew at a certain point in his career, he was never going to get promoted any higher than where he was, kind of lower management, let's say, okay? So he doesn't believe in the goal anymore of achievement. But he does believe in the means that society's socialized into him, so he keeps plugging away at his job, and he goes every day, and he doesn't even like his job, and he gets a gold watch when he retires. That's called ritualism. It's just, you just chug along and plug along, but you don't really believe in this great goal anymore. Retreatism, you don't accept the goals and you don't accept the means. Okay. And an alcoholic is an example they give there. I would say a drug addict, or people who go live, give up everything and go live in the woods off the grid is maybe a more positive example of retreatism. But they don't accept the goals of the society anymore, and they don't want to do the things that you're supposed to have to do to obtain those goals. And then the final one is in the social strain theory, and this all depends on how much strain you're feeling, right? Is rebellion. And that means I want to replace the goals, and I want to replace the way of obtaining those goals. The example they're giving you in your text is anti-government militia groups, but also the 60s countercultural revolution, the hippies and the anti-war movement were part of that rebellion. We don't want your rules. We don't want your goals. We don't want to plug away the job we hate forever. We want to rebel and replace it with new values. Okay, that's the functionalist perspective. You see, they're very deeply into it. They have a lot of ideas about crime and about deviance. Well, so do the conflict theorists, and as you might expect, they're very, very different, right? So basically, when they look at deviance, what they are analyzing is capitalism and social inequality. And there's this question I have in so many situations is like, what did you think would happen? Well, it's kind of that way. You have 70 billionaires in the United States, and you have the bottom that can't afford to eat, and a huge homeless population, and people losing their homes, et cetera, et cetera. What, didn't you think there might be crime and deviance and drug addiction and violence, people being angry about that, and a variety of other things? So the conflict perspective says if you have that much inequality in a society, you're bound to have crime and deviance. And so one of the things that happens from a conflict perspective is that those people in power view anything that threatens their own interests as deviance. And so when you got a capitalist economy based on private ownership of property, as you do in the United States, and it's characterized by personal gain, get as much as you can yourself, rather than thinking about the collective well-being of people. Okay, so I'm thinking once again about the billionaires here, but you could put multimillionaires, throw certainly in there. I mean, how many yachts do you need? How many 30,000 square foot mansions do you need? That type. It doesn't mean you can't have any, but how many do you need, and how much of that wealth are you willing to contribute to a kinder, gentler society? So capitalism's goals include, of course, continually maximizing profits, accumulating wealth, and promoting economic self-interest. In fact, those are those very goals that we are taught as American children. That's how we're socialized. Those are the goals. So from the conflict perspective, capitalism promotes crime for several interrelated reasons. Capitalism actually promotes crime from a conflict perspective. Okay. First is greed and self-interest. Greed and self-interest tends to perpetuate deviance. So we're going to look at white-collar crime, for example, that we just discussed. 2, capitalism itself is a competitive system that encourages corporate crime. And 3, capitalism creates a lot of social inequality. I just talked about that a minute ago, about the people at the top. When we get to the chapter on economics, I think it's this term, but if you take 205, it's there. Or if you take Soc 206, which is social problems, there's a chapter on this kind of the economic system in the United States, and you'll see the disparities and how it's just, I don't even want to get into it right now, but it's pretty bad. And then the current U.S. tax system allows companies to avoid paying 135 billion each year in taxes. There are 50 top corporations in the United States that pay zero taxes. Nike is among them, for instance. You could Google all of this and look it up. And so those taxes, I had to chuckle when I typed up these lecture notes because this is exactly what is being discussed right now and that Elizabeth Warren is talking about, of course, with the billionaire tax, is that those taxes, if they were paid, and this, we're talking about here by corporations, not necessarily individuals, um, could provide crucial investments in, does this sound familiar recently? Healthcare, infrastructure, education, homelessness, on and on and on. And then the other thing that the conflict theorists look at: laws, power, and social control. So from a conflict perspective, the laws basically serve the interests of the ruling class. And so it's the most powerful groups in society that make the laws, that control the law, that define what's deviant and who will be punished. So I love this little bullet point in the chapter right here. It says, "Why do so many high status people commit crimes?" And the answer in your textbook is because they can, and that's right. They rarely get busted for them. They rarely have any consequences for it, because most white collar crime isn't criminalized. They have more opportunities for deviance, and they're rarely prosecuted, CEOs and things of that nature. There are very few penalties for high status crimes because the lawmakers and the defendants share the same cultural backgrounds. They went to Yale, Harvard, Princeton, whatever. They go to the same country clubs. Their wives know each other, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And when prosecutors do bring charges, the fines are usually less than, get this, 0.5% of the annual revenues. And that fine, even that little bit, is passed on to the shareholders in the company. So now let's quickly look at the feminist perspectives. Actually, I'm going to stop this video and start a new one to finish up the chapter so we don't run out of time.